When the river woke before the people. Long before there were grand temples along its banks, long before stone columns rose to meet the sky, the Nile was simply a quiet presence in the lives of the people who lived beside it, a long, slow-moving breath of water that defined their days without asking for attention. Each morning, the river woke before the people did. In the grey light just before dawn, when the world still felt half asleep, the surface of the Nile shifted gently. Small ripples moved from bank to bank, carrying pieces of reflected sky across the broad, patient current. Birds began their morning calls in the reeds, not loudly, but steadily, as if reminding the world that movement was returning. Mist sometimes hovered just above the water, a pale veil that softened every shape. The distant outlines of palm trees and mud brick homes blended into one calm silhouette. Fishing boats, tied to posts or anchored near the bank, rocked almost imperceptibly in the current. The people living along the river did not wake to alarms or shouted calls. They woke to gradual change. A faint brightening of sky creeping in through doorways. A shift in the air, the coolness of night giving way to a very gentle warmth. The repeated sound of water being lifted in clay jars. In the small villages strung along the Nile, homes were simple, mud brick walls, flat roofs, low doorways. Courtyards opened to the sky, catching the first light. Sleeping mats lay neatly rolled in corners, ready to be spread out again when evening came. The first to rise were often those whose days were most tied to the river itself. A father preparing to check nets might step out in silence, careful not to wake the rest of the household. A young woman carrying empty jars would walk toward the bank, the ground cool under her bare feet. An older man might sit on a low stool near the edge of the water, simply watching the changing colors over the far bank. No one hurried. There was no reason to rush the river. The Nile moved at its own measured pace, and the people had long ago learned to match it. Along the shore, the wet strip of dark earth marked where the water had recently touched. Above it lay the slightly higher, drier ground where people walked, worked, and rested. The villagers knew every curve of the shoreline, every small inlet where plants grew thicker, every patch of sand where boats could land more easily. As the sun slowly lifted above the horizon, the river's surface shifted from gray to pale gold. The mist began to thin, revealing details, the texture of reeds, the faint movement of small fish near the surface, the pattern of ripples around anchored boats. By this time, more of the village was awake. Cooking fires were kindled in courtyards, sending thin threads of smoke upward. Grain was poured into grinding stones, the slow, circular motion of hands creating a quiet, rhythmic sound. Children stirred, blinking sleep from their eyes, drawn almost automatically toward the open doors and the soft light. The Nile did not dominate their thoughts. It was simply there, like the sky, like the earth, like the steady rhythm of breathing. Everything in their lives began from it. Water for drinking. Water for cooking. Water for shaping mud into bricks. Water for irrigating fields when the flood receded. The villagers did not need to discuss this connection. They lived it every day. As the light grew stronger, boats began to move. Small fishing boats pushed away from the bank with a soft scraping of wood against wet soil. Oars dipped gently into the water, creating circular ripples that spread outward and dissolved into the main current. Nets lay folded in the center of the boat, still damp from yesterday's work, ready to open once more. On the opposite bank, where the land stretched wide into fields, farmers stepped onto narrow paths leading away from the water. Most of the year, the fields were arranged in simple rectangular plots, their boundaries formed by low ridges of earth. In the early morning, dew sometimes lay on the plants, catching the light in small, quiet gleams. The people understood the river's moods. They knew its low season, when the water remained narrower and calmer. They knew its flood season, when the Nile rose, spread outward, and left behind a dark, rich layer of silt as it retreated. These changes were not feared, they were expected. The villagers had grown used to this long, repeating breath of rising and falling water. Houses were built slightly higher than the usual flood line. Paths followed safe routes. Storage rooms were arranged where ground stayed dry even in high water. In this way, the Nile's yearly cycle shaped not only the fields, but the layout of the villages themselves. From above, from the perspective of a bird gliding high over the valley, the scene was simple and calm. A wide band of blue-gray water winding between strips of vibrant green along both banks. Beyond the green, a paler stretch of dry land, fading into distant desert. Tiny rectangular patterns of houses, courtyards, and small enclosures gathered close to the water, like clusters of shells near a shoreline. The people went about their routines quietly. They did not think of themselves as living in a civilization, nor did they imagine their homes would one day be considered part of a great river culture. They simply followed rhythms that felt natural, rising when the sky brightened, working while the air was cool, resting when the heat deepened, returning to fires, stories, and dim lamplight at day's end. Everything was ordinary to them. To us, it is the soft beginning of a long, gentle history along the Nile. The river flowed on. The people matched their lives to its pace. And together, they formed one of the earliest and quietest partnerships between humans and water. Within its normal bed, wide and calm, with defined banks. The field stretched outward from the water's edge, crisscrossed by paths and raised boundaries. But at a certain time, signaled by distant rains that the villagers did not see but felt through changes in air and current, the river began to rise. It did not rush. It swelled. Water crept up the banks slowly, filling low-lying areas first, then spreading outward into prepared basins and channels. The color of the water changed, carrying fine dark soil from far upstream. The villagers watched calmly as the edge of the river approached fields and marks they knew well. Children followed older relatives to see where the water had reached compared to previous years. This stone was dry last year, someone might say quietly, touching it with their toes. This year, the water covers it. These observations were simple but important. They helped families understand how much new silt the flood would leave behind, and how wide the fertile strip might be when the water retreated. During the height of the flood, many fields disappeared beneath the surface. Boundaries dissolved. Paths vanished. The land and the water fused into a broad, shallow sheet stretching from bank to bank. Yet the people did not feel lost. They knew that beneath the water, the field still existed, waiting. They understood that this temporary covering was the river's way of renewing the soil. What looked like absence was actually preparation. Life during the flood shifted more toward the village itself. Boats replaced footpaths. Fishing became easier in some areas, harder in others. Work moved to tasks that could be done indoors or on rooftops, repairing tools, weaving, grinding stored grain, drying fish caught earlier. On some days, the flooded water lay still, reflecting the sky like an enormous, calm mirror. Palm trunks, reeds, and the tops of boundary ridges created small islands and lines in the glassy surface. Birds walked in the shallows, their legs barely visible, their reflections lengthened. As the weeks passed, the flood's strength eased. The surface lowered by small amounts each day. Mud ridges re-emerged. Paths returned, first as faint lines, then as firm roots. When the water finally withdrew fully into its narrower bed, it left behind a layer of dark, fine silt. The villagers stepped onto this renewed ground with quiet respect. The soil was soft underfoot, cool and slightly damp. It smelled rich, heavy with the promise of growth. This layer was the Nile's gift, a silent offering delivered each year without ceremony. No speeches were made about it. No declarations were necessary. The people responded by working. They marked fields again, using simple tools to smooth and shape the surface. Seeds were brought out from storage rooms, carefully kept through the lean months. Furrows were dug, neither too deep nor too shallow, guided by habit rather than precise measurement. The work proceeded at a steady pace. There was no rush, the timing was already synchronized with the flood's retreat. The people had learned over generations exactly how long the newly deposited soil stayed moist, when to sow, and how to space each crop. In planting season, the fields became an extension of the village's quiet rhythm. From a distance, one might see scattered figures bending at regular intervals across dark ground. No shouting, no hurried movements, just repetitive, gentle gestures. A hand reaching into a bag, a seed falling, a foot pressing earth lightly. The children learned these motions early. They watched their elders, imitated them, dropped seeds of their own. The fields became both classroom and inheritance. As plants sprouted, the color of the valley changed. The dark brown of fresh silt gave way to thin lines of green, then fuller patches, then broad swaths of growing crops. Wind moved through this green like a second, gentler river, creating waves of motion that mirrored the slow current of the Nile itself. The people's days were shaped by both water and plant. They checked irrigation channels, many of them simple grooves leading from small openings cut into the riverbank. They redirected flow by building or removing temporary earthen barriers. They knew which fields needed more moisture and which retained water longer on their own. There were no machines, no pumps, no complex devices. There were hands, thoughtful eyes, and a deep understanding of what the land could hold. In the evenings, after work in the fields, people returned along paths that ran parallel to the river. The Nile reflected the sky's changing colors, soft oranges, pale pinks, fading blues. The calm water seemed to rest after its long service of rising, receding, and feeding the soil. Sitting in courtyards or on rooftops, families felt the presence of the river even when they could not see it. They heard distant water sounds, gentle lapping against the banks, the shift of reeds, the soft bump of boat hulls. They smelled damp earth cooling in the night air. They felt a kind of assurance, as long as the Nile continued its steady cycles, life would continue in roughly the same way. There were, of course, years when the flood was lower than expected, or higher than usual. But even then, the people responded not with panic, but with adjustment, saving more, stretching stores, planting slightly differently, coordinating more closely with neighbors. Always, their response was guided by the river's own pace. The Nile did not hurry. It did not stop. It moved steadily between its banks, carrying silt, fish, water, and quiet meaning from one season to the next. Through floods and plantings, through cycles of growth and harvest, the river taught the people a simple but enduring lesson. That life does not need to be rushed to be full. That stability can emerge from slow repetition. That abundance can come from patience and trust in a pattern that returns year after year. The people did not write this lesson down. They lived it. With each seed pressed into damp soil. With each jar dipped into cool water. With each evening spent listening to the soft breathing of the river that shaped their world. Pressed into molds, left to dry in the open air. The bricks carried the river within them, its soil, its moisture, its silt washed down from far upstream. When placed into walls, these bricks created interiors that stayed cool during the day and warm at night. Inside, rooms were arranged in slow logic. A main living space with mats rolled neatly against one wall. A small area for grinding grain. Storage niches, shallow excavations lined with clay. A place for oil lamps, usually on a small ledge near the entrance. Most of life happened not inside but in the courtyard, which served as workshop, kitchen, gathering place, and resting area. The surface was packed earth, smooth, warm, familiar beneath bare feet. Each courtyard had its quiet signatures. A clay jar leaning near the doorway for water. A woven basket hung from a peg, drying in the sun. A cat stretched along a shaded wall. Several stones arranged as supports for cooking pots. Nothing in the courtyard was ornamental, everything had a soft purpose. In the early morning, courtyards echoed with gentle sounds. The steady grinding of grain. The soft brushing of reeds used to clean mats. The quiet slosh of water poured into vessels. These sounds were not intrusive. They blended into a rhythm that defined village life, a rhythm as steady as the river's current. Meals were simple and followed the river's offerings. Wheat and barley were ground each morning, mixed with water, baked into flatbreads. Sometimes fish dried from previous days' catches were added. Sometimes beans or lentils simmered in clay pots over low fires. Families ate together in the courtyard, usually seated on mats or low stools. Children ate quickly, eager to step outside and observe the village waking around them. Children learned by watching. They mimicked adults grinding grain or carrying water. They followed older siblings toward the fields. They inspected fish with curiosity, tracing patterns on scales. They collected small stones and arranged them in patterns along the ground. There was no formal schooling, the world itself served as teacher. Animals lived closely alongside people. Goats bleated softly in small enclosures, nudging against wooden rails. Dogs dozed in shaded corners, lifting their heads only when footsteps neared. Geese wandered freely through courtyards, their soft honking echoing across rooftops. Though animals were not formally domesticated in the modern sense, they formed part of the village's fabric, part workers, part companions, part observers. As the morning passed into midday, the heat deepened. Life slowed. The Nile shimmered brightly, its surface flattening under the weight of the sun. Work paused. Conversation softened. Many people retreated indoors, where air remained cool and dim. Only necessary tasks continued. Checking nets. Tending animals. Repairing sandals or tools. In the shaded interiors of homes, walls reflected faint light. Dust motes drifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, catching whatever brightness entered through small slit windows. By late afternoon, the energy shifted again. People emerged from homes, refreshed by rest. Courtyards regained their gentle activity. Cooking fires were rekindled. Children returned from wandering near the river's edge, bringing reeds, stones, or stories of small fish darting through shallows. Evenings carried a sense of soft gathering. Neighbors visited each other's courtyards. Water was fetched once more, the coolness welcome after the heat. Baskets were inspected. Tools were organized for the next day. And as the sun lowered over the western desert, rooftops became the village's final room of the day. Up narrow steps carved directly into the walls, families climbed to sit on mats laid across packed clay. The rooftops, still warm from the day's sun, offered a breezy refuge. From there, they watched the sky slowly deepen in color, pale yellow becoming muted orange, then gentle rose, then a softening blue. The river below mirrored these transitions, rippling with gradient light. Conversations were quiet. Children leaned against parents, growing sleepy. Lamp flames flickered from doorways below. The smells of evening cooking drifted softly through the air. Life along the Nile did not feel rushed or fragmented. Each day flowed into the next with the same gentle continuity that guided the river. These villages were not temporary camps, they were slow-built worlds, shaped by repetition, steadiness, and trust in familiar patterns. And through their courtyards, rooftops, and riverbanks, the people created a life that held both simplicity and quiet richness, a life that stretched outward in small gestures, connecting each person to the land, the river, and one another, angling their pointed ends toward whichever way the flow carried them. Most boats were simple creations. They were built from bundles of papyrus reeds tightly tied and shaped into narrow forms that curved slightly upward at both ends. These reed boats remained surprisingly buoyant, absorbing water slowly and drying just as easily in the sun. Their lightness allowed anyone, from children to elders, to guide them with ease. Larger boats, made from wood, were rare but essential for transporting heavier goods, jars of grain, baskets of vegetables, bundles of firewood, woven mats destined for nearby villages. These wooden boats sat deeper in the water, leaving long, gentle wakes as they moved. People spent much of their day tending to the river's quiet demands. Nets were checked each morning. Some nets hung from simple wooden frames set along the bank. Others were cast from boats. The nets themselves were made from flax fibers twisted into fine cords, forming diamond-shaped openings just wide enough to catch fish that swam near the surface. Each day, the nets absorbed a little more of the river. They darkened, stiffened, and softened again under the sun. They carried the scent of water, silt, and the hands that repaired them. Men and women both participated in fishing, though often in different ways. Men cast nets from boats farther into the river. Women used shallow baskets or small nets near the reeds. Children waded in quiet pools, cupping hands to chase tiny fish between their fingers. These moments were not framed as work, they were simply part of life's rhythm. Reeds, which grew thickly along the banks, provided materials for countless tasks. They were cut at dawn when they were still cool and flexible. Some reeds became mats for sleeping. Others became baskets for carrying grain. Many were woven into traps for small fish or used to reinforce boats. The people treated reeds with respect, never cutting too many from the same patch. Reed stands stabilized the soil, sheltered young fish, and softened the wind along the river bank. The river taught moderation long before the concept existed in writing. During mid-morning, boats moved with gentle purpose. From a distant hill, one might see several reed boats drifting like dark strokes against the pale water. Oars dipped slowly. No one rowed quickly, speed was unnecessary and wasteful. The river's current did most of the work, carrying boats downstream effortlessly. When traveling upstream, people used long poles, bracing them against the riverbed in slow, steady motions. Each stroke of the pole created a ripple that joined countless others. A quiet reminder of how many generations had moved the same way. The river's surface shifted under different light. In bright midday, it glittered with small, sharp reflections. In late afternoon, it became matte and soft, its color deepening into calm blues and grays. During the flood season, its expanse widened, transforming boats into tiny silhouettes against a shimmering plain. Every household interacted with the river in its own rhythm. Some families fished daily. Others used boats mainly for travel between fields and homes. Still others filled their days repairing reed bundles, mending wooden planks, or shaping new oars. Boats, like rooftops, served many functions. A boat might carry tools to distant fields, then return filled with bundles of harvested plants. It might transport visiting relatives from a nearby village. It might become a place of rest, gently rocking in shallow water as the occupant watched clouds drift overhead. In the calmest evenings, boats were pulled slightly onto the bank, where they rested like sleeping animals. The wet earth beneath them held impressions of their curved hulls. People checked ropes, folded nets, and lifted baskets filled with fish. These small tasks concluded the day's work with unhurried, mindful care. As lamplight glowed from village courtyards, the river's edge became a place of transition. Children rinsed their feet. Women washed tools. Fishermen examined their catch under dim orange light. Soon the river darkened completely, reflecting only the faintest glimmers of stars or the moon. Boats sat quietly. Reeds swayed softly. Nets dried slowly in the cool air. And another day along the Nile passed, not dramatically, but gently, with the same patience that shaped all life along its banks. The quiet work of hands, tools, food, and the soft labor of daily life. Life along the Nile flowed through hands, hands grinding grain, hands shaping clay, hands tending fires at dawn and dusk. Every gesture was slow, deliberate, and deeply connected to the rhythm of the river. The people did not hurry through their tasks. They did not measure productivity in speed. Instead, the quality of a day was felt through the feel of their work, the weight of grain in a basket, the warmth of sun on drying pottery, the texture of cooled mud beneath bare feet. Most mornings began with grain, the foundation of nearly every meal. Wheat and barley were stored in cool granaries, small rounded rooms with low ceilings and smooth walls. Opening one of these rooms released a distinct scent, the warm, earthy smell of stored harvest, a mixture of dust and sun-dried kernels. Women carried handfuls of grain in baskets, pouring them into shallow grinding stones. The lower stone was heavy, anchored firmly. The upper stone fit neatly into the hands. Grinding was slow, circular, almost hypnotic. The sound, stone against stone, became part of the morning's steady music. Children, hearing it daily, grew to associate the rhythm with comfort and the promise of food. As the flour thickened in the basin, it gathered into soft mounds. Water was added gradually, mixed with fingers that had long ago learned exactly how much moisture was needed. The dough, once formed, rested beneath a cloth in a shaded corner, while fires were prepared nearby. Cooking fires were never large. A few dry reeds, a handful of twigs, perhaps a small piece of charcoal from the previous evening. Flames rose low and steady, warming clay surfaces atop simple stone arrangements. Flatbreads baked quickly, spread thin, flipped once, warmed just enough to be pliable. Their scent drifted across courtyards and alleys, joining other everyday smells, clay warming under sunlight, reeds drying beside doorways, fish smoking slowly over tiny fires. Meals were not lavish events. They were moments of stillness. Bread, beans, lentils, fish, the food of the Nile Valley relied on what the river and soil offered naturally. Tools were simple but essential. Wooden spoons, their surfaces softened by years of stirring. Clay bowls, uneven in shape but perfectly functional. Stone mortars, used daily and passed down across generations. Flax fiber baskets with patterns that repeated themselves quietly across centuries. People repaired tools more often than they replaced them. A cracked bowl received a patch of clay. A worn basket received new reeds. A stone mortar, chipped at one edge, was simply turned to reveal another smooth surface. Nothing was wasted. Everything was tended. Children learned these tasks early. They watched their mothers knead dough, their fathers mend nets, their grandmothers patch baskets. Their small fingers attempted the motions. Their mistakes were not corrected sharply, they were absorbed into the day's rhythm. In the afternoons, after the brightest heat, more specialized work began. Fields closer to the village needed tending, small channels cleared, ridges reinforced, weeds pulled gently from the moist soil. This work was quiet and mindful. Farmers did not shout across fields. They did not work in frantic groups. They moved slowly, often alone or in pairs, accompanied only by the rustling wind and the calls of birds circling above the river. Harvest season was the most vivid example of this calm cooperation. Families moved through the fields with small curved blades, cutting stalks one handful at a time. Grain was bundled, tied, and carried to drying areas. The process was repetitive, meditative, and guided by patterns passed down through countless generations. Meanwhile, in the village, ovens warmed for bread making. Clay pots simmered with legumes. Children gathered around mats layered with herbs and seeds, sorting them with tiny, earnest fingers. Cats wandered near the edges, hoping for stray grains or discarded bits of fish. The pace of life had no sharp transitions. Morning flowed into afternoon. Afternoon dissolved into evening. Work interlaced with rest so gently that one never felt the boundary between them. A day's labor ended without fanfare. Tools were wiped clean. Baskets were stacked. Fires were smothered. Flour-covered surfaces were brushed with reed bundles until smooth again. The Nile's people were not idle, they were simply unhurried. They carried the understanding that time moved consistently, patiently, and that their own lives were extensions of a much older cycle, one defined not by urgency, but by the slow, steady giving of the river and the land. And so the work of the hands, humble and continuous, shaped a life that was full without excess, rhythmic without rigidity, peaceful without stillness. Songs of the river, community gatherings, shared stories, and the soft ties between neighbors. Though the villages along the Nile were small, life within them felt deeply connected. People lived close not just physically but emotionally. Their days were parallel, shaped by the same cycles of sowing, harvesting, fishing, mending. And in the quiet hours before and after work, these shared rhythms wove the community together. Evening was the time when these bonds revealed themselves most clearly. As the sun dipped behind the western desert, leaving a warm glow on the river's surface, people drifted toward one another almost instinctively. Courtyards filled with soft conversation. Door curtains remained open. Lamps were lit gradually, their flames reflecting on clay walls in gentle patterns. Children were the first to gather. They played simple games, arranging pebbles in lines, drawing shapes in dust, racing along short alleyways with quiet laughter. Their energy softened as the sky darkened, matching the slow mood of the village. Adults gathered in small clusters. Women sat together weaving baskets or repairing mats. Men inspected tools, retied nets, or shaped small wooden implements. Elders observed with gentle satisfaction, offering stories when the mood invited them. Stories along the Nile were not told with dramatic gestures. They were shared in low voices, paced slowly, like the steady current of the river. Some stories described the flood of a remarkable year, when the river rose higher than expected, covering fields deeper than memory predicted. Others retold simple observations, how a certain heron returned every season to the same patch of reeds, or how a particular fig tree ripened slightly earlier than others in the village. No story needed embellishment. Its value lay in the peaceful repetition. Songs also rose in the evenings, but they were not performance pieces. They were soft, rhythmic murmurs, the verses used to soothe children, to accompany grinding or weaving, or to ease the transition into night. Their melodies were simple, repeating in gentle loops. A typical song might mention the kindness of the river, the patience of growing plants, the return of birds, the comfort of home. These songs were carried more by tone than by words. Hearing them drift across rooftops created a sense of shared belonging, an invisible thread binding the village. Communal tasks reinforced these bonds. When a roof needed repair, neighbors appeared without being asked. When someone carried heavy water jars, another stepped forward to assist. If a family welcomed a newborn or mourned a loss, the entire village adjusted its rhythm in quiet acknowledgement. People did not speak in terms of obligation. They simply responded to one another's needs as naturally as they responded to the flow of the river. In the cool seasons, larger gatherings formed on rooftops or in open courtyards. Families shared dates, dried fish, flatbreads, occasionally honey. Children fell asleep in laps as voices blended into a meditative hum. Sometimes, a trader from a neighboring village joined the evening circle. Visitors were welcomed with water first, food second, stories third. These gatherings did not aim to entertain. They aimed to settle, to gently align each day with the long continuity of the past. As night deepened, the village grew quieter. Lamps flickered, their flames growing low as oil diminished. Dogs settled at doorways. Cats curled on warm rooftops. The river itself seemed to slow, reflecting only the faintest shimmer of moonlight. One by one, people withdrew to their homes, drawing reed curtains across doorways. The final sounds were familiar, the clink of a clay lid being adjusted, the rustle of mats unrolled, the soft exhale of someone settling into sleep. In this way, community life along the Nile unfolded without ceremony, without structure, without haste. Together, the people formed not a grand civilization, but a continuous, gentle network of shared routines. Each day, they lived alongside one another. Each evening, they rested alongside one another. Each season connected them more deeply to the land, the river, and the quiet history they were collectively shaping. Their world did not seek grandeur. It sought harmony. And harmony, along the Nile, came softly. In stories. In songs. In gestures felt more than spoken. Creatures of the riverbank, animals, quiet cooperation, and the shared rhythm of life. Along the Nile, people did not live alone. Their days intertwined with the habits of birds, fish, insects, goats, cattle, cats, and countless smaller creatures whose presence shaped the flow of each morning and evening. Life in the river valley was not a single species endeavor, it was a network of beings moving together in calm, overlapping cycles. Before sunrise, animals were often the first to stir. Not loudly, but gently. Geese waddled toward the water's edge, their feet leaving soft, webbed impressions in the damp soil. They pecked at the weeds in shallow pools, cleaning spaces that humans later crossed. Egrets and herons, tall and patient, stood like pale sculptures near the reeds, waiting for tiny fish to swim close enough for a swift beak. Their movements were slow, elegant, and entirely in harmony with the stillness of dawn. People recognized these rhythms and rarely disturbed them. The animals' behaviors offered subtle information. When the water levels were shifting, when fish were plentiful, when insects were emerging in new clusters. In this way, animals became quiet indicators of the Nile's moods, their actions forming a kind of living calendar. Goats were among the earliest companions of the rural households. They wandered freely in open courtyards, nudging doors with soft, curious heads. Their hooves tapped rhythmically against hardened earth, creating a sound that blended effortlessly into the gentle hum of the village. Goats ate leftover reeds, wilted leaves, and bits of grain that would otherwise have been wasted. In return, they provided milk shared across families. Cattle, heavier and slower, often grazed in small groups on slightly higher ground where vegetation grew thick during the flood's retreat. They moved deliberately, swaying with a calm, predictable energy. The villagers used them not only for milk, but also as living barometers of weather. If cattle clustered together tightly, people knew the night air would be colder. If they moved restlessly, a shift in wind or moisture was approaching. Cats, sleek and purposeful, were both helpers and quiet companions. They roamed rooftops and courtyards, keeping grain stores safe from mice. Villagers welcomed them openly, leaving warm places for them to rest. A cat curled in the corner of a courtyard became a familiar sight, its slow breathing in harmony with the steady pulse of daily activities. Along the river, fish were constant sources of sustenance and subtle guidance. Different species appeared in different seasons, their patterns telling fishermen when to cast nets deep and when to stay near the surface. Tiny, shimmering fish signaled cool weather returning. Larger, slower-moving fish indicated the approach of warmer days. People learned these cycles without conscious study, they absorbed them naturally, the same way they absorbed the river's scent and temperature. Occasionally, hippos appeared at a distance, massive bodies rising briefly from the water before submerging again into silence. Villagers observed them with respect, never approaching too closely. Their movements shaped decisions about fishing routes and reed gathering but did not provoke alarm. Even dangerous animals were woven into the valley's rhythm, understood through generations of calm coexistence. Birds, more than any other creatures, filled the Nile with gentle life. During the cool seasons, hundreds of them gathered along the water. Pelicans glided effortlessly across the surface. Swallows traced delicate arcs against the sunrise. Ducks paddled in loose groups, leaving soft ripples that expanded outward like fading thoughts. Bird migrations were among the villagers' favorite spectacles, not celebrations, not formal gatherings, just quiet moments of collective watching. People paused in their work when flocks of birds crossed the sky in wide, slow formations. The birds marked changes in seasons long before written calendars existed. In the evenings, animals returned to familiar spaces. Goats gathered in enclosures. Birds settled on reed roofs. Cats stretched near warm walls that still held the heat of the day. Their presence made the village feel whole. People never attempted to separate themselves from the creatures around them. The animals' rhythms shaped crop timing, fishing patterns, food stores, and even spiritual practices. Some families placed small bowls of grain near shrines as gestures of gratitude, not offerings to a deity, but acknowledgement of the river creatures that supported their lives. Humans were not above the animals, nor were they dependent on them in a single direction. Life along the Nile was a partnership, soft, natural, balanced. From the outside, it might have seemed ordinary. From within, it was a peaceful coexistence built across centuries of quiet observation. The people did not try to dominate the animals. They tried to understand them. And in understanding them, they understood the river itself. Sky, wind, and quiet weather, the subtle climate of the Nile Valley. If the Nile shaped the ground, the sky shaped the mind. Life along the river moved not only with water, animals, and fields, but with the slow, predictable changes in light, wind, temperature, and cloud. These atmospheric rhythms guided behavior with the same calm authority as the river's flow. The sky above the Nile was rarely dramatic. Storms were uncommon. Clouds were soft, thin, and widely spaced. Most days began with pale gold light and ended with a slow drift into pink, purple, and deep blue. But subtlety did not mean insignificance. Villagers learned to read the smallest cues. A shift in wind direction meant a change in how fast nets dried. A faint haze over the horizon signaled that upstream rains might have begun. A certain smell, earthy, slightly sweet, told farmers that floodwaters would soon rise. These observations did not require calculation. They required presence. People looked upward frequently, not out of curiosity, but out of partnership with the world. The sky told them when to wake, when to work, when to rest, when to remain still. During the day, the sun governed activity with gentle authority. At dawn, it warmed rooftops and dried morning dew. By late morning, it strengthened, guiding people indoors or into shaded courtyards. During midday, the heat pressed downward softly but firmly, encouraging rest. In the late afternoon, it softened again, signaling safe hours to continue tasks. Its daily arc was so reliable that people used sunlight as a timekeeper without ever naming an hour. But the sky's most profound influence came from the winds. There were several types, each with its own personality. Cool morning winds flowed along the river, carrying fresh scents. Midday winds were sparse but predictable, offering brief relief. Evening winds drifted down from distant hills, calming the fields and smoothing the river's surface. Sailboats relied on these patterns, raising their square sails at just the right angle to capture a slow, steady breeze. Children learned to identify wind shifts by watching how reeds bent along the river bank. Night brought a different sky. A sky that encouraged deep rest. Stars blossomed slowly across the darkening blue. Their patterns were familiar. The long curves of constellations passing over rooftops. The slow rotation of bright points marking the passage of seasons. People rested on rooftops, watching the sky move so gradually that it seemed like time itself was stretching. Some families lay quietly together, naming a few stars they had learned from elders. Others simply breathed, letting the cool air settle over them. The night sky did not frighten them. It soothed them. It contained no loud storms, no rushing clouds, no sudden flashes. Just the slow turning of distant lights. Steady, predictable, timeless. Even the moon played its part in the calm choreography. A crescent moon guided night fishing in shallow pools. A full moon illuminated fields enough for late harvesting in cool seasons. Its cycle helped families determine when to prepare certain foods, when to patch roofs, and when to reinforce storage rooms. The climate of the Nile Valley was not simply weather. It was a companion. Steady in its rhythms. Gentle in its signals. Subtle in its changes. Life adjusted to it naturally. People did not resist the heat, they planned around it. They did not fear the dark, they rested in it. They did not lament the flood, they prepared for it. Each atmospheric detail was woven into the deep tapestry of daily and seasonal life. And so, with river, earth, animals, wind, and sky moving together in soft harmony, life along the Nile flowed with a serenity unmatched in other ancient landscapes, a serenity born from listening, from watching, and from knowing that the world spoke most clearly when it spoke quietly. From the land, shaped not by grand ambition but by the daily needs of families who lived in harmony with the river's pace. Every home began with mud, the simplest and most available building material. People mixed river silt with chopped straw and water in shallow pits. They kneaded the mixture slowly with their feet, working in silence or speaking softly to one another. The mixture thickened over time, absorbing the warmth of the sun, becoming pliable and ready to shape. Then came the molds. Wooden frames, worn smooth by generations of use, gave mud its form. A worker pressed handfuls of the mixture into the frame, smoothing the top with wet hands, then lifted the mold away. The resulting brick lay on the ground like a warm loaf of earth. Rows upon rows of these bricks stretched across the sunlit courtyards, drying, hardening, breathing out moisture. The sun did more than dry the bricks. It gave them character. A brick dried slowly carried a deeper color. A brick dried quickly under strong heat became lighter, almost golden. A brick dried under clear skies bore tiny cracks that added texture and strength. Children helped in small ways, passing straw, fetching water, arranging bricks neatly. Their laughter formed a soft soundtrack to the slow work. Yet even they understood the seriousness of building. Homes were not temporary shelters, they were extensions of family history. When enough bricks were ready, the building began. Walls rose quietly. One brick laid upon another, joined with fresh mud mortar that smelled of wet earth. Builders used simple wooden tools to keep surfaces straight, though perfection was not the goal. The aim was stability, shade, and comfort. Most homes followed a familiar pattern. A small front room for daily tasks. a larger interior room for sleeping and storage, a courtyard open to the sky, and a rooftop that served as the household's final evening refuge. Over time, families extended these structures. A new child meant an added sleeping alcove. Improved harvests meant a larger storage space for grain jars. An aging family member meant a shaded ramp or lower sleeping area. No two homes were identical. Yet all homes belonged to the same architectural language. A language shaped by the materials of the Nile Valley and the calm patience of its people. Rooftops were especially important. Made from layers of reed mats covered with packed clay, rooftops stayed cool at night and warm at dawn. They were places where grain dried, where fish smoked, where tools rested, where sleep came easily beneath open skies. Rooftops connected homes both physically and emotionally. From above, one could see the entire village moving through its quiet routines. The village layout grew not through plans, but through need. A path widened because families passed through it often. A new home leaned naturally into the curve of an existing wall. Streets formed like rivers, guided by footfalls, smoothing their direction over decades. Craftspeople shaped the village subtly. Carpenters carved wooden beams from local acacia, smoothing them with stone tools until they fit perfectly into walls. Mat weavers created thick reed mats that insulated floors and rooftops. Potters shaped jars whose rounded forms became as recognizable as the silhouettes of distant hills. Brickmakers, though rarely celebrated, provided the foundation for every structure. Their work was quiet, repetitive, calming. If one walked through a Nile village at midday, one might see a potter's wheel turning slowly, the clay rising and falling under a steady pair of hands. Or a weaver smoothing new reed mats in the shade. Or a carpenter silently testing the fit of a beam against a wall. There was no rush. A jar that took a day to shape might take another day to dry and another to fire. A mat woven today might be used next month. A house expanded this season might be extended again the following year. And so the village grew, not upward, but outward, forming a patchwork of courtyards, walls, paths, and rooftops that blended gently with the riverbank. Nothing felt temporary. Nothing felt forced. Everything was shaped by time, sunlight, and the soft patience that defined life along the Nile. The architecture was not meant to impress. It was meant to support life, to hold families in quiet stability, to allow generations to rise and fall like the river's seasonal breath. A visitor walking through such a village would not find grand monuments. They would find something far more enduring. A living landscape built by steady hands, maintained through shared effort, and shaped by the understanding that nothing in life, homes, fields, families, or the river, moves quickly. And in that slowness, the people found comfort. They built not with haste, but with the rhythm of the land. Expanded gradually, sometimes by only a single home, other times by multiple extended households joining together. But even as populations grew, the quiet character of the settlement remained. Growth did not bring noise or confusion. It brought more hands, more stories, and a deepening sense of continuity. Expansion began with observation. Families noticed where shade fell during different seasons. They noted which paths remained dry during high water. They watched how wind moved through courtyards. Only then would a decision form. This is where the new wall should go. Or, this is the place where our children will sleep. New construction blended into existing architecture with gentle ease. Walls curved subtly around trees that families refused to cut. Homes grew into one another, sharing walls to stay cooler. Open areas shifted shape, forming new communal corners where neighbors gathered in the evening. A village that once consisted of 10 homes might quietly become a village of 20, yet still feel as intimate and calm as before. With growth came more craftspeople, each contributing to the shared rhythm. Basket weavers, sitting in shaded alcoves, created sturdy baskets for grain, fish, reeds, and tools. Their fingers moved methodically, weaving patterns that looked simple but had been perfected through generations. Stone polishers shaped tools used for harvesting, smoothing their surfaces against flat stones until they shone softly in the light. Clay sealers prepared thick lids for grain jars, ensuring that harvest stored through winter stayed fresh. These lids bore fingerprints, small impressions left unintentionally by hands that had shaped countless others. Lamp makers formed small oil lamps whose flickering glow defined every evening. Their forms were modest, shallow bowls with wide rims, but they were essential to nightly life. And then there were those whose craft had no specific name. The quiet tenders of paths, the watchers of irrigation channels, the maintainers of wells. Their work kept the village functioning smoothly, though they rarely spoke of what they did. As the village expanded, shared spaces took on new importance. Courtyards that once held a single fire now hosted evening gatherings. Flat rooftops became extended family rooms where meals were eaten under cool breezes. Narrow paths between homes were swept clean not by one household but by many, each neighbor tending a small portion. Community did not form through rules, but through repetition. Shared tasks became traditions. Repairing flood-damaged walls together. Widening a path when goats needed more room. Reinforcing riverbank steps where children fetched water. Smoothing rooftop clay after strong sun cracked its surface. These acts created a sense of collective belonging. The village did not belong to anyone, it belonged to everyone. And as time passed, generations layered themselves into the architecture. A home built by grandparents gained a new room for their grown children. A workshop expanded into a courtyard when grandchildren learned the craft. A rooftop that once held drying grain became a sleeping space for a new family. Architecture became memory. Cracks patched repeatedly over decades held stories of seasons long past. Paths worn smooth marked favorite childhood routes. Courtyard walls darkened by cooking fires recorded meals shared across generations. Even the river's own behavior shaped the village's evolution. During years with higher floods, families built slightly more elevated doorways. During lower floods, irrigation channels were extended farther. People listened to the land and adapted quietly, without dramatic change. The village grew like a tree, adding rings, expanding outward, branching gently. And through all this change, the people remained deeply connected to their surroundings. Their days were shaped not by ambition but by rhythm. Their nights were shaped not by fear but by the comfort of flickering lamplight. Visitors from other regions might not have seen grandeur in these settlements, but they would have sensed something rare. A profound stillness, a deep-rooted continuity, a life shaped entirely by cooperation with the land and one another. This was the slow transformation of the Nile villages. Not into cities, not yet into kingdoms, but into enduring communities whose quiet ways would form the foundation for centuries of culture. Fields, animals, and architecture, but also by the soft, steady rituals of preparing and sharing food. These rituals were never rushed. They unfolded slowly, guided by the day's temperature, the season's offerings, and the quiet cooperation within families. Before sunrise, the first spark of the morning fire was lit in many courtyards. The flame was small, simply enough to warm a clay pot or bake the first round of flatbreads. Women and older children tended this fire with practiced simplicity, arranging twigs, feeding small pieces of dried reed, blowing gently to coax the flame into a warm glow. The smell of the morning fire, a blend of smoky reed, warm clay, and the faint sweetness of wet earth drifted through narrow alleys and joined other fragrances that lived in the village air. Dough prepared the previous day rested under cloths, rising slowly as the river breeze cooled the courtyard. When uncovered, it held the faint scent of yeast and grain, a quiet reminder that food, like life, transformed gradually. Bread was shaped with gentle hands. Flattened. Smoothed. Pressed lightly by fingertips that carried the memory of thousands of earlier loaves. On warm days, dough softened quickly. On cool mornings, it resisted, requiring more time and patience. But no one rushed it. Bread followed its own rhythm. The flatbreads were laid along the hot clay surface of simple ovens, either dome-shaped structures built against courtyard walls or low, open hearths that radiated heat evenly across the cooking stones. The bread bubbled slightly as it cooked. A soft hiss marked the release of moisture. A subtle change in smell, the aroma turning nutty, signaled that the bread was ready to be lifted. Meals were eaten quietly. Bread, beans, lentils, vegetables from small gardens, and fish dried earlier in the season formed the foundation of most meals. Each item carried the taste of the river valley, the mineral depth of silt-rich soil, the brightness of sun-warmed plants, the calm patience that guided every harvest. Storage was as important as preparation. The Nile people built granaries, small round structures with thick clay walls and narrow openings. These granaries stayed cool even during the hottest months. Inside, wheat and barley were stored in large jars sealed with mud or clay lids. Opening one of these jars required soft movements, turning, tapping, lifting. The release of grain produced a comforting whisper, like sand shifting beneath feet. Families kept many types of jars. Tall jars for grain. Wide jars for water. Small jars for oils and herbs. Narrow jars for dried fish or preserved foods. Each jar had its place, and each place held its own quiet significance. Water jars, for example, were often kept near the shadiest part of the home, where breezes cooled their surfaces. When someone dipped a small cup into the jar, the water was always cool and refreshing, a direct inheritance from the river but softened by clay and time. Herbs dried slowly in baskets hung from beams. Their scents, mint, fenugreek, dill, coriander, floated gently through air, marking seasons as clearly as the river's flood. Children often paused to smell the herbs, though they rarely spoke aloud about what they sensed. Scents became part of memory, forming ties between place and emotion. In the afternoons, families prepared meals for the evening. Clay pots simmered with legumes, onions, and vegetables gathered from fields. The sound of simmering food blended with the soft clatter of pottery, the hum of conversation, the occasional bleat of a goat nearby. Cooking was not a chore. It was a calming transition from day to night, a ceremony performed daily, connecting past and future. Elders shared memories of how their grandparents cooked the same dishes. Children listened quietly, absorbing stories as naturally as they absorbed warmth from the fire. When food was ready, families gathered in courtyards or on rooftops, depending on the temperature. Plates were simple, flat clay pieces or woven mats on which bread and vegetables were arranged. No decorations, no excessive items. Just nourishment presented in a way that felt peaceful and complete. Sharing food was also a way of sharing time. The act of passing bread from one hand to another, the soft sound of clay bowls touching the ground, the murmured thanks whispered under breath, these small rituals reinforced the bonds of community. Meals ended slowly. People lingered. Children dozed against their parents. Fires softened into embers. Oil lamps were lit one by one as darkness crept across the sky. The nourishment from these meals was not simply physical. It was emotional, spiritual, communal. The food connected every household to the land, the river, and the deep rhythm of life that pulsed quietly beneath everything. And so, in preparing, storing, and sharing food, the people reaffirmed their belonging to each other and to the Nile itself. Soft darkness that held every home in its quiet embrace. As the last embers of cooking fires faded, oil lamps were lit. These lamps, shaped by skilled hands from simple clay, burned with small, steady flames fueled by pressed oils. Their light was not bright. Instead, it cast a warm, amber glow that softened everything it touched: walls, baskets, sleeping mats, the tired faces of families settling into rest. The lamps flickered in rhythmic patterns as breezes drifted through open doorways. Their shadows danced gently along mud brick walls, creating shapes that moved as slowly as the river's current. Children often watched these shifting shadows before sleep, imagining stories in their quiet motion. Evenings were the time for soft conversations. Families gathered in courtyards or on rooftops, speaking in tones only slightly above whispers. People recounted small events from the day. A new bird seen near the river. A change in wind direction. A tool that needed repair. A young goat that wandered too far before being found. These stories were simple, yet they carried a comforting familiarity. They reminded everyone that life followed a steady, predictable path. On rooftops, the air cooled quickly. People spread mats woven from reeds, their surfaces worn soft by years of use. Some placed small cushions beneath their heads. Others preferred to lie flat, letting the warmth of the clay roof seep into their bodies as they gazed upward. The night sky over the Nile was vast and clear. Stars appeared slowly, one by one, punctuating the deep blue with quiet points of light. Constellations familiar to generations moved in slow arcs overhead. Adults recognized these patterns instinctively. Children traced them with fingers, trying to follow the slow rotation that unfolded across hours. The stars guided more than imagination. They guided time itself. Families could tell when the night was half over by the position of certain bright stars near the horizon. Fishermen knew when to rise for early catches. Farmers knew when the cool air signaled the beginning of seasonal shifts. The moon, too, played its role. A crescent moon meant gentle nights. A half moon offered more light for late conversations or quiet work. A full moon illuminated entire courtyards, allowing tasks to continue well after dusk. Its reflection on the river created a path of silver that rippled with the slightest movement of water. Sound softened as night deepened. Goats settled in their enclosures. Birds tucked their heads beneath wings. Fishermen's boats tapped gently against wooden posts. Reeds rustled in the faintest wind. Occasionally, the distant call of a night bird echoed across the fields. Nothing startled. Nothing rushed. Even the creatures that moved in darkness, cats on silent paws, insects humming near lanterns, did so in a gentle rhythm. Inside homes, the final preparations for sleep unfolded quietly. Water jars were sealed. Clay lids were pressed onto storage pots. Door curtains were lowered. Children were guided to mats, where they curled under thin blankets woven from flax. Adults stretched their limbs, letting the day's work drain from their bodies. Sleep came naturally in this world, without need for ritual beyond the simple act of lying down and letting the night surround them. The air cooled. The earth breathed. The river whispered its steady sound. Some elders remained awake a bit longer, watching the stars. They did not guard the village, there was no fear. They simply enjoyed the final minutes of wakefulness. The deep stillness. The freedom from heat. The memory of countless nights just like this one. Eventually, even they lay down to rest. Night settled completely. The last lamp flickered out. The sky stretched endlessly above the quiet rooftops. The river moved slowly, carrying small reflections of moonlight downstream. In these hours, when conversation ceased, when fires cooled, when wind softened, the Nile villagers felt their deepest connection to the world. It was in these silent moments that the rhythm of life became most clear. A gentle cycle of work and rest. Sunlight and lamplight. Warmth and coolness. Day and night. Life and renewal. The village slept as a single, breathing community. Calm, steady, and timeless. Just as it had for countless generations along the river. It's more than something to drink or cook with. It was the quiet backbone of daily existence, something stored, directed, shared, and honored through countless small practices that rarely drew attention but shaped everything around the villagers' lives. Even though the river flowed generously, families understood the importance of preparing for days when water needed to be carried farther from its banks. And so, villages developed a delicate system of wells, jars, channels, and shaded storage areas, each contributing in small but essential ways to the gentle rhythm of life. The wells were perhaps the oldest and most constant features of these settlements. They were simple holes dug deep into the earth, lined with stones or reinforced with mud brick rings. A wooden beam sometimes stretched across the opening, supporting ropes that had guided countless clay jars downward. When pulled up, the jars emerged dripping with cool water that smelled faintly of minerals and damp soil. Drawing water from these wells was not hard work. It was slow work. Measured breaths. A gentle tug. A pause to let droplets fall back into the well before lifting the jar fully. People often spoke in low voices while filling jars, as if respecting the echoing space beneath them. The well was not holy in a formal sense, but it carried a quiet gravity, holding within it the memory of floods, rains, and underground streams older than any household. The clay water jars used for storage were thick-walled and rounded. Their shape kept water cool even on the hottest days, and their surfaces absorbed condensation that evaporated gently in the breeze. Families stored these jars in the shadiest corners of their homes, often placing them on elevated stands made from stacked stones or smooth pieces of wood. The sound of pouring water into these jars, the soft, steady splash, became part of the auditory fabric of the village. Children recognized this sound instantly. It meant relief, nourishment, and a moment of stillness. Beyond immediate storage, villagers also shaped the land itself to guide water. During the months when the Nile began its slow rise, families prepared earthen channels leading from the riverbank into fields or shallow basins. These channels were not deep, they needed only to encourage water to flow naturally along paths worn through years of repetition. Some were straight. Others curved around clusters of reeds, rocks, or old tree roots. The maintenance of these channels was a communal effort. Not because it required coordination, but because everyone understood its importance. A family walking past a partially blocked channel simply cleared it. Children rearranged small stones to redirect trickles of water. Elders inspected the soil after the flood receded, making modest adjustments based on how the river behaved that particular year. It was a practice of gentle correction, not control. The Nile was far too vast to command. Instead, the villagers guided it softly, like adjusting a blanket or smoothing a rug. Just enough direction. Never force. In the dry months, the channels appeared as faint lines across the ground, soft depressions holding memories of water now gone. People walked over them without worry, knowing they would come alive again with the next flood. These lines connected the river to the fields to the granaries, and the granaries to the life of every family. Water was also used in clay work, and its presence influenced how pottery, bricks, and storage jars were shaped. Potters often kept a bowl of water at their side, dipping fingers gently to smooth surfaces or soften rough edges. The water darkened the clay temporarily, bringing out richer tones that revealed imperfections or beautiful natural lines in the material. Children loved playing near clay workshops because they could push small impressions into wet clay, fingers, shells, pieces of reeds, leaving marks that sometimes remained faintly visible even after firing. These marks were not mistakes. They were stories, traces of life woven into everyday objects. During the hottest days of summer, water became a source of comfort beyond drinking or irrigation. Families splashed it lightly on courtyard floors to cool the ground. Women dampened reed mats before hanging them on doorways, letting breezes pass through and soften the air inside homes. This simple method created a natural cooling system that kept rooms comfortable even under intense sun. But perhaps the most peaceful interaction with water happened in the late afternoons, when the heat began to ease. People washed hands, faces, and feet in shallow basins filled earlier in the day. The water felt warm at first, then slowly cooled as the evening progressed. This washing was not a ritual of purity, it was a ritual of transition, marking the shift from work to rest. The river itself changed color as the sun lowered. Its blues deepened into grays. Its surface flattened. Its ripples softened like cloth settling after being folded. Villagers sometimes walked to the riverbank simply to watch it breathe in the fading light. The gentle movement of water reassured them that the world still followed its ancient rhythm, unbroken, dependable, familiar. Even at night, stored water in clay jars held a soft glow when touched by lamplight. The jars became quiet companions in the darkness, reminding families of the next morning, the next meal, the next moment of drawing water from well or river. Water was not a dramatic force in their lives. It was a constant, a presence, a quiet teacher. And in guiding it, storing it, and living alongside it, the people along the Nile learned one of the most important lessons of their world. That life's most essential elements do not need to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes they simply need to flow, are beyond numbers. Time, for them, began with light. The first hint of dawn, the faint paling of the sky above the eastern fields, signaled the start of the day. Before birds called, before animals stirred, before fires were rekindled, the changing sky announced that night had ended. Families woke not because they had to, but because their bodies had learned to attune to the gentle glow growing behind distant hills. The progression of the day was understood through shadows. Shadows slid across courtyards, lengthened against walls, softened on rooftops. A short shadow meant cool hours still remained for work. A long shadow meant it was time to retreat indoors. A faint shadow meant evening was approaching. This living clock never erred. The seasons followed a similar slow clarity. In the Nile Valley, seasons were not marked by abrupt changes. There were no sudden storms, no violent freezes, no rapid shifts. Instead, the world altered itself with gentle nudges, a breeze becoming slightly cooler, a constellation rising earlier, the smell of the river thickening before the floods. The flood season itself was the anchor of the year. Its arrival reshaped fields, paths, and routines. Its retreat revealed dark, fertile soil. Families saved seeds for this time, knowing that planting too early or too late would risk poor harvests. But the flood's timing was not guessed. It was felt. People watched for signs. More fish near the surface. Birds gathering reeds. Insects appearing in predictable patterns. Children learned these signs not through instruction, but through daily experience. After the flood came the growing season, when the valley brightened with young crops. Green shoots spread across the fields like soft carpets. The dry desert beyond remained unchanged, creating a striking contrast between life and stillness. Families spent long mornings tending these fields, bending gently, inspecting the soil with practiced fingers. Then came the harvest season, the quiet culmination of the year's labor. There were no celebrations, no feasts, no loud announcements. Just steady movement through fields, soft voices calling to one another, the rhythmic sound of stalks being cut. Harvest was not an event. It was a continuation of life. Time also flowed through the sky. Constellations served as guides. A cluster of stars rising above the eastern rooftop signaled the transition to cooler months. Another cluster setting low over the river meant that warm winds would soon return. The villagers did not name these stars formally, but they recognized their patterns instinctively. Even the moon offered its own calendar. A new moon signaled nights of deep darkness and long rest. A half moon allowed fishermen to travel safely late into the evening. A full moon illuminated fields well enough for work to continue under its silver glow. The moon's reflection on the river became a second moon, rippling, stretching, fading, returning. Children often watched this reflection before sleep, noticing how it drifted slowly across the water as the night progressed. Time was also felt in the body. Elders spoke of seasons as if they were living beings. Soft ones, patient ones, beings that visited each year without fail. A cool wind brushing across the fields meant joints would ache less. Warm air settling on rooftops meant sleep would come swiftly. A sudden silence of birds meant the heat of midday would soon arrive. People watched the world. The world watched them. And together they moved through time with a calm mutual understanding. Life along the Nile did not demand schedules. It offered rhythms. Days unfolded. Nights deepened. Years layered one upon another like silt on fields. Soft, steady, almost imperceptible. And through these cycles, the people sensed something profound. That time was not meant to be controlled. It was meant to be followed. As gently as one follows the curve of the river. The bend of a path. The arc of the sun across the sky. Quiet trade, floating goods, and the gentle exchange between Nile villages. Although the Nile villages often appeared self-contained, each one harvesting its own grain, shaping its own pots, weaving its own mats, there existed a subtle, steady exchange between communities that kept the valley connected in ways that were almost invisible. Trade, in this world, was not an event. It was a current, flowing slowly and predictably along the river just as water did. At dawn or late afternoon, small boats often appeared on the horizon, slender shapes drifting with the current, guided by soft pushes of wooden poles or the faint pull of square sails catching the gentlest winds. They carried not large cargo, not wealth, not the trappings of markets, but simple goods, baskets of herbs, jars of dried fish, bundles of reeds, small stacks of pottery whose surfaces still held the warmth of firing. These boats approached the village quietly. No shouts. No calls announcing arrival. Just the soft scrape of wood against shallow banks and the polite greeting of travelers stepping onto the familiar muddy shore. Trade happened in courtyards, shaded by reed mats and slow-moving breezes. A family would bring out their goods, perhaps extra grain, perhaps a particularly well-crafted jar, perhaps woven mats whose patterns showed careful and patient artistry. Visitors placed their own goods beside them. There were no precise values assigned, no tally stones, no written accounts. Instead, goods were exchanged through mutual recognition of usefulness. A jar of honey might be traded for a sturdy basket. A bundle of reeds might be traded for a clay pot. A collection of herbs might be exchanged for dried fish. The process was slow, with long pauses in which both parties touched items gently, considering their texture, weight, and freshness. Children watched with wide eyes, absorbing the unspoken rules. Be patient, be generous, be observant, and above all, be calm. Sometimes, travelers stayed for a meal, sitting on mats while fresh bread warmed in ovens. They shared stories, not dramatic tales, but quiet accounts of how the river behaved near their villages, how the floodwaters shifted paths that year, how birds arrived earlier or later than expected. Such stories were more valuable than goods. They offered insight into the river's broader breadth, its movements far beyond any single settlement. Occasionally, boats carried goods that seemed almost luxurious: beads made from shells found near distant shores, resin with a sweet scent, soft cloth dyed with natural pigments. These items were not used to display status. They were admired quietly, then put to practical use or stored for special occasions such as births or community gatherings. Trade also extended across seasons. During harvest times, villages with abundant grain shared with those who had received less. During flood seasons, families passed repaired nets or long poles to neighboring fishermen. In drier years, reeds harvested upriver were brought downstream to help rebuild rooftops or reinforce riverbank steps. Everything moved in cycles. Nothing was hoarded. Nothing left the system of mutual care. Even the boats themselves were part of this rhythm. Some boats traveled in familiar routes. Villages recognized them by their shape, their patchwork repairs, or the distinctive way their sails were stitched. These boats became quiet symbols of trust, their arrival reassuring everyone that life flowed as it should. When trade was done, people walked the visitors back to their boats. Goods were loaded carefully, preserving their balance. Small lamplights from the village flickered along the river as boats pushed gently away, drifting into the wide, calm water. The river accepted these boats as part of itself. Baskets shifted softly as water lapped against wooden hulls. Clay jars clinked faintly, cushioned by straw. Shadows lengthened across the surface, merging boat and river into one slow-moving silhouette. Where they traveled next was predictable only in spirit, not in timing. They would stop at the next village when ready, rest when needed, move when wind or current suggested movement. Trade was not a business transaction. It was an exchange of life, quiet, steady, built on trust and shared understanding. Through this gentle trade network, villages never felt isolated. Even the smallest settlement sensed its place in a long chain of communities stretching along both sides of the Nile. Goods, stories, tools, materials, and knowledge flowed through these quiet channels, binding the valley together. Thus, the Nile did more than nourish fields. It nourished relationships. It connected strangers. It ensured that no village, no family, no child lived entirely alone within its gentle embrace. And the people, moving through these rhythms generation after generation, found comfort in knowing that they belonged to something both local and vast, something slow, steady, and enduring as the river itself. By presence. A girl sat beside her mother as clay was kneaded, feeling the coolness of the mixture. A boy watched his father mend nets, noticing how certain knots tightened cleanly while others slipped apart. Children traced patterns in reed mats, imitating the motions of older siblings who wove them with practiced calm. Teaching happened in silence. An elder would work slowly, letting a child observe every movement. The child, without being told, repeated the motion. No praise, no correction, just a gentle nod, an unspoken agreement that learning had begun. Each craft carried its own rhythm. Pottery was soft and circular. Clay spun slowly on simple wheels or shaped by hand. Fingers dipped into water smoothed imperfections. Thumbs pressed gently to form rims. The potter's breath aligned with the rotation, steady, even. Basket weaving followed a different pace. Long reeds bent willingly once soaked. The weaver's hands moved in patterns that mirrored water currents, over, under, pull, tighten. Weavers often hummed while working, low melodies that matched the repetitive nature of the task. Wood carving was the slowest craft of all. Carpenters worked with small blades made from stone or copper, shaving thin layers from beams or tools. The sound, soft scraping, filled quiet workshops like a second heartbeat. Carpenters rarely spoke, they listened to the material, sensing where it wanted to bend, how it wished to be shaped. Painting and pigment work emerged occasionally, simple lines on pottery or small strokes on wooden boxes. Pigments came from natural sources, charcoal for black, ground ochre for red, crushed shells for pale colors. These colors were not used for decoration alone, they indicated contents of jars, directions within granaries, or ownership within families. The passing of skills was not a moment. It was a lifelong movement. Children became helpers. Helpers became assistants. Assistants became masters without ceremony. Mastery was recognized in the softness of motion, not in words. Crafts adapted slowly. A new technique appeared only when needed, usually in response to a change in harvest, a shift in climate, or the arrival of a traveler with a different method. But even changes blended seamlessly with tradition. One generation's innovation became the next generation's ordinary practice. Workshops held the memory of these transitions. Walls darkened by years of clay dust. Tools worn smooth where hands had gripped them. Floors polished by countless footsteps circling the same tasks. As evening approached, workshops often glowed softly in lamplight. Shadows lengthened across benches. Clay pieces set out to dry cast gentle silhouettes. Reeds hung above doorways rustled in faint breezes. The air smelled of earth, fiber, and smoke, a scent as familiar to villagers as the smell of the river itself. Crafts were not simply skills. They were acts of belonging. To learn to make a pot was to join generations of potters. To weave a mat was to connect with ancestors who had slept on similar mats under similar skies. To carve a wooden tool was to shape something that might outlast one's own life and serve a child yet unborn. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was done for spectacle. The purpose of each craft was the same: to sustain life gently, reliably, and beautifully without calling attention to itself. In this way, the people of the Nile lived through their hands. They shaped the world one quiet movement at a time. And in doing so, they shaped themselves, calm, patient, and deeply connected to the land that had supported their ancestors for countless generations. They unfolded with the same gentle tone as everything else in the village, quietly, respectfully, and in harmony with the rhythms of the river. Birth, for example, was not a public event. It was a quiet unfolding within the shaded interior of a home, often in a room cooled by clay walls and softened by woven mats laid out carefully on the floor. When a woman felt the first signs of labor, neighboring women gathered, not in urgency, but in calm companionship. They brought water jars, cloths softened by years of washing, and herbs that eased breathing. Voices stayed low. Hands moved slowly. Children were guided gently outside, where they played quietly or sat with elders who kept them nearby but occupied. Hours passed with the same patient flow as the river. When the child finally arrived, its first cry rose softly through the home, not sharp, not startling, but a small, delicate sound that drifted into the courtyard like a whisper of new life. There were no loud announcements. No feasts. No declarations. Instead, the mother rested while another woman placed the child on her chest, skin against skin, breath against breath. The midwives cleaned quietly, preparing warm water for washing. Someone rekindled the fire, simmering a simple broth for the mother. Soon after birth, the child was wrapped in soft cloth and carried into the courtyard to feel the evening air. There, under the sky that watched over every generation, the family gathered to choose a name. Naming was done in a gentle circle. Each elder offered a suggestion, not in competition, but in reflection of qualities they hoped the child might hold: patience, steadiness, kindness, good harvests, or even a simple reference to nature, reed, sun, river, grain. Sometimes names honored ancestors, sometimes they described the day's weather, or the season, or the sound of birds at dawn. The chosen name was spoken only once, softly, and then allowed to settle into the life of the child without repeated emphasis. A name here was not a marker of identity in the way one might imagine, it was more like a wish carried gently on the current of life. As the child grew, the entire village participated, unconsciously, in raising them. Babies moved easily between households. Young children wandered safely between courtyards. No one questioned it, the community was an extended family. Other transitions, too, carried this softness. Unions between families, what others might call marriage, were simple agreements between households. When two young people began spending time together, weaving mats side by side or working fields along the same path, neighbors noticed. Parents observed quietly. Eventually, when it was clear the bond was steady and mutual, families arranged a small meal. Bread was shared. Nets were inspected. Reeds were offered as gifts. No formal vows were spoken. No ceremonies were necessary. Instead, a new sleeping space was prepared, a small room expanded from an existing wall or a section of rooftop enclosed softly with reed mats. And just like that, a new household was formed, its routines blending seamlessly into the existing rhythm of the village. Death, too, was approached with calm acceptance. When an elder passed away, the village did not erupt in mourning rituals. Instead, neighbors visited quietly, offering water or bread to the family. The body was washed gently, wrapped in simple cloth, and carried by a few close relatives to a soft, elevated patch of land not far from the village. There, under the open sky, a shallow resting place was prepared. Stones were arranged. Hands worked slowly. Words were not necessary. Death was not seen as interruption but as continuation, emerging back into the earth that had nurtured life for decades. The elders who passed away had long become part of the village's memory, their lessons and stories carried forward by those who listened as children. Some families placed small tokens near the resting place, a smooth stone from the river, a reed tied into a loop, a piece of pottery shaped long ago. These items were not offerings. They were reminders of hands that once shaped the world gently. Afterward, life in the village resumed its slow movements. Fires were lit, fields tended, clay shaped. But in each routine, the presence of the one who passed remained, subtle yet enduring. Across all these transitions, birth, naming, unions, death, there was no urgency, no complexity, no spectacle. The community moved as it always did, softly, in small motions, guided by deep understanding that life, like the river, flowed in cycles. Moments of change were simply quiet pauses along a continuous path. In this world, the most significant events unfolded not with noise but with stillness. And everyone understood that stillness was not emptiness, but fullness of meaning. It was the space where life breathed most clearly. Elders, memory, and the slow wisdom that shaped generations. As seasons passed and generations layered themselves like silt upon the banks of the Nile, the elders of the village became living archives, repositories of memory, experience, and quiet understanding. Their knowledge was not presented in lessons or commands. It existed in the way they moved, watched, paused, spoke, and sometimes in the way they remained silent. An elder's presence in a village courtyard brought a certain stillness. Not because they demanded respect, but because their rhythm of life had slowed to match the deepest pace of the land itself. Their steps were deliberate. Their breaths were steady. Their eyes lingered on details others might overlook, the direction of wind in the reeds, the subtle color of new soil, the way children held tools for the first time. Children gravitated toward elders naturally. Not for entertainment, but for comfort. To sit near an elder was to feel anchored to something larger, something timeless. Elders rarely initiated conversation. They waited for questions. And when a child asked, "Why does the river rise?" or "How do we know when to plant?" the elder responded with slow stories that never felt like answers, but like pathways. A typical story might begin with a memory. "I remember a flood that reached the third step of the granary ladder." Or, "When I was young, the birds returned earlier than they do now." These stories did not conclude with moral lessons or instructions. Instead, they invited the listener to observe more carefully, to pay attention to the world unfolding around them. Elders knew that wisdom was not something taught directly. It was something grown, like seeds that sprouted only when the surrounding soil was ready. Daily life gave elders many places to watch from. Shaded doorways, rooftop corners warmed by sun, riverbanks where reeds moved softly, storage areas where they monitored jars and baskets, pathways where they greeted neighbors with slow nods. Their hands, though aged, still remembered the motions of craft. Some elders continued shaping clay, their vessels slightly uneven but full of quiet grace. Others mended nets with fingers that trembled but knew every knot by heart. Still others wove reed mats, the pattern simpler now but deeply familiar. In each action, the elder demonstrated not productivity, but presence. Presence was the heart of their wisdom, the ability to give full attention to one task at a time, without rush, without distraction, without desire for praise. Villagers observed this presence and absorbed its calmness. Evenings highlighted the elders' central role. As stars filled the sky, elders often spoke about constellations, not in the scientific sense, but as markers of memory. They recalled seasons when a particular star rose later, or when the moon looked fuller even before its peak. Children listened while lying on mats, their eyes following the elders' slow gestures tracing the night sky. These stories were not about the stars. They were about time. About understanding that the sky moved in gentle cycles, just as the river did. Each transformation laid itself gradually upon the one before it, creating a slow-moving continuity that shaped every home, every path, every field. Children who once learned to walk on soft clay floors grew into adults who built new walls, expanded old courtyards, and mended roofs with reeds gathered by their own hands. A generation later, those same adults became elders who watched the next children trace the same paths they once followed. In this way, the villages felt both old and new at the same time, ancient in routine, yet always refreshed by new laughter, new work, new stories told under the same steady patterns of sun and star. Over decades, the village itself shifted in shape. Some households expanded toward the riverbank, adding small rooms or new entryways as children grew into their own families. Others retreated slightly toward higher ground during years when the floods rose more generously than expected. These movements were subtle, unplanned, and entirely natural. Paths curved according to the footsteps of each generation. Walls thickened with new layers of mud. Water jars gained small repairs that became part of their character. Mats on rooftops softened into familiarity through thousands of evenings. Nothing stayed perfectly still. Yet nothing truly changed. The people measured time not in years, but in cycles. Cycles of flood and soil. Cycles of planting and harvest. Cycles of children becoming helpers, helpers becoming craftspeople, craftspeople becoming elders. Even the riverbed itself shifted minutely over time. Sediment created new inlets. Reeds migrated in slow arcs along the bank. Birds nested in slightly different patterns each season. The villagers observed these shifts, not analytically, but with quiet familiarity, like recognizing a small change in a friend's expression. The memory of the village lived not on walls or in tools, but in gestures repeated through centuries. A young woman smoothing the top of a clay jar echoed her grandmother's motions. A boy dipping his hand into cool water at the well mirrored the posture of generations before him. A family spreading mats on a rooftop recreated an evening ritual older than any single life. Sometimes travelers arrived from villages far upstream or downstream. They noticed patterns invisible to locals. The way rooftops sloped slightly in a shared direction. The way courtyards centered around nearly identical cooking stones. The particular tone of evening songs drifting across the river. What seemed ordinary to residents appeared harmonious to outsiders, a sign of deep-rooted culture shaped by the Nile's rhythm. Over time, trade routes became so familiar that entire generations could predict which goods would arrive in which season. Pottery from upstream held slightly different textures. Reed baskets from downstream villages carried distinct weaving patterns. Honey from distant marshlands tasted richer and darker. These subtle differences reminded villagers that life extended far beyond their own horizon, even though they rarely traveled far. Meanwhile, elders continued to guide the village silently. Their presence offered stability, even as the physical layout changed. They remembered when the well was first dug, when a particular courtyard wall was built, when rainfall arrived earlier or later than usual. And through their stories, slow, reflective, and often told beneath rising constellations, they ensured that memory flowed like the river, steady, reliable, inseparable from daily life. As generations passed, the village identity deepened. No one attempted to define it. No one wrote it down. It simply existed, carried in collective habits, in the scent of evening fires, in the familiar texture of the clay beneath bare feet. Time pressed forward softly. Babies grew into elders. Homes were repaired countless times. Fields were plowed, planted, harvested, then left to rest. The river rose and fell with the same calm breath each year. Villagers accepted these cycles with gentle ease. They knew that every life, like every flood, every breeze, every star path, was part of a far larger pattern. Not something to resist, but something to inhabit. And in that recognition, they found a sense of peace that lasted across centuries, a peace woven from countless moments too quiet to notice individually, yet profound when viewed as a whole. Drifts toward its close, the river itself continues, unhurried, unchanged in essence, moving through time with the same quiet confidence it has held since before the first homes appeared along its banks. The river does not know the names of those who live beside it. It does not mark the generations that rise, grow old, and pass away. Yet it carries traces of every life lived along its edges. Tiny grains of soil shaped by footsteps. Fibers shed from reed mats. Ashes from cooking fires cooled by morning breezes. The Nile remembers not through language, but through movement. Everything given to it becomes part of its slow journey northward. A journey that will continue long after today, and far beyond the horizon of memory. During the quietest hours of dawn, when the village still sleeps under cool air and drifting starlight, the river reflects the sky as though time itself were resting upon its surface. Palm trees stand like faint silhouettes. Boats, moored at the shore, sway gently. Reeds whisper soft patterns that sound almost like breathing. If one stands at the riverbank at this hour, it is possible to feel not just the present, but the presence of all mornings before it. The mothers drawing water. The children skipping stones. The fishermen adjusting nets. The elders watching light gather along the eastern edge of the world. Every action repeated becomes part of the land's memory. Every routine becomes a thread in an unbroken fabric stretching deep into the past. As sunlight returns, the village awakens in its familiar rhythm. Fires are lit. Bread is pressed. Nets are inspected. Fields begin to fill with quiet workers. Boats ease away from the banks. Nothing dramatic announces the start of the day. It simply begins, as it always has, following a river that never hurries and never stops. Over countless seasons, the people come to understand something profound. That their way of life is not fragile, nor accidental. It exists because it flows in harmony with forces larger and steadier than any individual. The rising and falling of water. The slow shifting of stars. The gentle pulse of seasons. The soft renewal of soil. This harmony shapes not just routines, but worldview. The villagers learn to value presence over speed, cooperation over competition, maintenance over novelty, continuity over change. They build homes designed to be repaired, not replaced. They cultivate fields designed to rest, not be exhausted. They raise children to observe before acting, to listen before speaking, to notice the faintest shifts in wind, water, and light. And because of this, life feels spacious. Not in terms of land or wealth, but in the deep quietness that fills each day. There is room to breathe, room to move slowly, room to sense the world rather than race through it. In the evenings, families once again gather on rooftops. Children fall asleep in the arms of adults whose bodies still carry the day's work. Elders watch the horizon fade into soft hues. Oil lamps flicker gently against clay walls. And above it all, the stars trace their ancient roots across the sky. Roots known to countless generations before, and countless more yet to be born. The village continues, not by striving for permanence, but by accepting impermanence as part of its natural cycle. Homes will weather, tools will wear, paths will shift, people will come and go, each one leaving behind gestures, habits, skills, stories. But the essence remains. The calm, the stillness, the harmony between land, water, and human life. In this timeless rhythm, the Nile becomes more than a river. It becomes a companion, one whose steady presence assures the villagers that they belong to something vast, enduring, and quietly beautiful. And so our story rests here, in a village that could be any village along the Nile, in a moment that could be any moment across thousands of years, wrapped in the same soft glow of firelight and starlight, guided by the same slow breath of the ancient river. Tonight, as the village sleeps once more under its gentle sky, the Nile flows on, patient, watchful, endless, carrying with it the calm echoes of every life lived along its shores.